moving forward, Comrade, I wanted to ask you about the ongoing Palestine movement globally. Because here even we noticed that when the entire global movement took off after October 7th, and there were protests going on everywhere, that is when the sort of mass movements in Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan also escalated to the next level. So we saw in real time how the Palestine movement gave way to anti-imperialist politics, a sort of revival of that, sort of bringing the conversation to how colonialism still exists and the forms it exists in and how to counter it. And, people started approaching that question. And, it was very intriguing for us to see the sort of mass movements that are going on, like the student encampments and all, especially in Western countries. I take it that you were quite involved in those. You've been covering them frequently, talking about them. So how do you see where that movement is right now, and what can potentially can we as organizers, achieve out of this movement, and what are the long-term questions and concerns that we should be having in order to build a long-lasting politics on this?
The first thing is that the Israeli war is hideous. I mean, it's genocidal and barbaric and so on. And it's not the case that people are responding to this because of, some other reason than the fact that this is a hideous bombardment. The Russian attacks in Ukraine are not even a percentage point as hideous as the Israeli bombings of Gaza. Hideous. I mean, targeted assassinations of people all over the place, killing of children, all of it is known. I think in Western countries, students responded because they are paying for this bombing and their governments are backing this bombing 100%. That's why there was greater politics there. I mean, why weren't, let's say, students in Kenya occupying universities? Well, because the Kenyan government is not sending weapons to Israel. Even the Indian government, which has close links to the Israeli government, didn't back this. In fact, there was a very interesting recently press conference in Delhi, where the parties of the left came together with different movements to say, oh, okay, listen, we completely are opposed to what you are up to. And we completely oppose this politics and so on. So, I mean, it's not like, the reason you have these big demonstrations in the West is because the West is backing this war. That's one. Secondly, there is a predictability of unpredictable politics. What's predictable, when people get politicized on issue A, they will then bring up issue B. Why? Because all these issues are with them. They have a multiplicity of grievances, but they are afraid of going and becoming political. Once the wall of fear is broken and they're able to be political on issue one, then it becomes unpredictable. You don't know where they'll go. In the United States, a lot of students who came out against Palestine suddenly then came out and said, I'm against imperialism. Or they said, I'm against the Democratic Party. Or I'm in favor of student loans to be forgiven. There's an unpredictability that happens. What's predictable is that when masses of people get politicized, the politics is a little unpredictable if there is no party structure guiding the way forward. So in a place like Balochistan, there is a party structure guiding the way forward. They have a unity of action, which is they have a certain grievance against the Pakistani state. That's driving them. But still, there'll be unpredictable things. Somebody may go back to their village. Having come to that big demonstration, this woman goes back to the village and says, domestic violence should end. Because the wall of fear is breaking for her. Other issues will come on the table. We as political people have to be prepared for that. Somebody who, I mean, you try to remember when you were at your first protest. somebody says to you, listen, Fatima, let's go to this protest, yeah? And you think, oh, I'm scared, it's going to be dangerous. Your parents find out, they're like, don't go, it's dangerous. I don't know anything about your parents, but they may have encouraged you, said, go ahead. They may have been leftists. I don't know. But chances are, some you feel fear. Even if you have a household of leftists, yeah, you feel fear. Then when you go there, you suddenly realize, my God, this is exhilarating. And yes, I'm still afraid, but I went with my friend, and then there's 2 and 5 and 8 and 10 friends. And afterwards, we all went and had a cup of tea somewhere, and we were chatting and bubbling with excitement. And in that bubbling of excitement, the wall of fear drops. And then you think, shit, I have this other issue, you know, that this issue on my campus of, this students whistling at, women students on campus. I'm going to do something about it now because I feel courage, I feel driven. This is a very powerful sentiment. So the issue of Palestine has come on the table from a lot of work people have done over the years, but also the hideous bombing of the Israelis, having motivated hundreds of thousands of people in Western countries to go out and protest. This has produced knock on effects, real political effects. Biden, part of the reason he had to drop out of the race was he was just going to lose Michigan. The Arabs were not going to vote. The reason Arab Americans had the courage to say we are not voting is that 50, 60, 100,000 people gathered at different protests, in Washington, D.C., and said, arrest Netanyahu, this, that, and the other. Um, Around the world, I mean, it's complicated. In Turkey, the protest was organized by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So it's a government protest. It's a different situation. The government people came to protest for Palestine. But other people also came. And other people also took the courage they got back to their localities. See, that's the thing, is after a million people come for a protest, there might be a million different changes in the world that develop that we don't always see. Because that one woman goes back to her village and says, I'm going to try to stop this. We can't have women lining up and fighting over the water. We need piped water, something. And they win. And then piped water comes there. And you don't think, shit, that piped water is a consequence of that big demo that I organized. We don't see that because we don't have 100% information. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the interesting thing is that was pretty much how my first protest experience went. Yeah, my parents are not in favor of it, but I went anyway. And yeah, here we are. And that's exactly, I came back and I was like, oh, I need to organize. There was other people who thought about the same things I did. And yeah, I suppose that is sort of how a person becomes politicized through these acts. So, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat. We might be able to take one or two of them. It is only a 1 hour session. So the last question I want to ask is, Comrade, what do you think, how can we go towards building the sort of internationalism that once existed? Of course, I mean, you cannot repeat history. It cannot be in that exact same form, but to strive towards building closer connections and supporting each other in a world today that takes into account regional struggles while also countering global imperialism. How do you see like balancing both of these things and moving towards that?
Well, for the last 8 years, 10 years maybe, I've been working on a project called the International People's Assembly, the IPA. In fact, the Kisan Mazdoor Party is part of the IPA in Asia. Um, it's a difficult process because internationalism isn't about having the correct line. It's not about having the exact correct line. Internationalism is about trust. There was a day, where the Soviets, with their immense prestige, could have called everybody to a communist international meeting. There is no Soviet today that has the prestige and resources to do this. So that means you have to use whatever means you have to build trust of political movements. In fact, build trust amongst leaders. Leaders have to learn to trust themselves. For that, they have to meet. This is all an enormous exercise. And for the last 10 years, we've brought together over 200 political movements into the International People's Assembly with great difficulty, I must say. It's not easy finding movements that are generally left oriented, with a common program, but no real line that we need to have in common. You understand? Because that's a meaningless thing. It's so easy to develop the perfect line. Perfect line doesn't change the world. What changes the world is unities of people. And so building trust among the leaders is important. You have to have, say, for instance, the space for a political organization to take a position different than you on a certain issue. There has to be enough space because everybody's not going to march in the same direction. It's much easier for a political party, let's say in Africa, to say I support the Russian invasion of Ukraine than it is for a party in Europe, in Germany. They have to take a much different calibrated position. So the leadership has to have trust in each other to give space, for people to take slightly different positions and so on. Building trust requires resources, it requires time, it requires also patience. And that's what we've been doing over the past 10 years, is bringing people together. And as I said, now we have 200 organizations in the International People's Assembly, almost all countries. And we operate together to build solidarity campaigns. Right now, we are building a campaign. I guess on August 9th, we're going to have a day of action for Venezuela around the world. Small things will happen. I'm guessing in Lahore, there'll be 50 people or 20 people standing with signs, don't hands off, don't interfere with Venezuela. Maybe 10 people in India, whatever. I know it's not masses of people necessarily, because this takes time and it's a process. I mean, Venezuela is one country among 190 countries in the world. Why should a Pakistani, a landless worker, have any interest in what's happening in Venezuela? It's a faraway place. They have their own problems. They say, why are you doing a protest for Venezuela? You should be doing a protest for my problems. We don't have water for our fields. I don't have, permanent tenure and so on. So internationalism is tough. It's not something that's evident. It's theoretically necessary. I understand it theoretically. It's an imperative in building a socialist project. It's theoretically necessary. But that doesn't mean that real living humans can see the theoretical necessity. And so you have to then fight hard to build the logic of something like of a way forward, really.